Something changes in you later in life that's really hard to explain to people that haven't gone through it yet, especially if you've already lived through chaos. And I don't just mean relationships either, I mean life in general. Divorce, betrayal, financial stress, trying to rebuild, losing people, being disappointed by people, years of anxiety, years of constantly trying to hold everything together. After enough of that, something in you starts valuing peace differently. And I've noticed the older I get, the less tolerance I have for anything that disturbs it. Not because I'm angry, and not because I hate people, and not because I think relationships are bad. I don't. I still believe good people exist. I still believe real connections exist. But I think once you've lost yourself, before, you become a lot more careful about what you allow into your life. Because I think most of us spend years abandoning ourselves trying to keep everybody else happy, trying to avoid conflict, trying to fix things, trying to prove our worth, and trying to be enough for people who were never really satisfied anyway. And after a while, you don't even recognize yourself anymore. That happened to me. And honestly, judging by the comments on some of these videos, I think a lot of people around our age know exactly what that feels like too. And are sitting in the same exact place that I was for years. Exhausted, disconnected from themselves, and not even knowing where to start putting their life back together again. And rebuilding yourself later in life is harder than people think. But honestly, I think that that's where this, next chapter of my own life is, what it's really about now. Not just talking about what broke me, but figuring out in real time how to finally take my life back without losing myself again. And the interesting thing is, I've already started that process. Little by little, I'm starting to see changes in myself and actually real progress. I'm calmer, more grounded, and less, desperate for validation, less willing to abandon myself just to keep other people comfortable. And for the first time in a long time, I actually feel moments of genuine peace and happiness, starting to come back into my life again. And it's not because somebody showed up and saved me, but because I finally started rebuilding my relationship with myself. And, I think that changes the way you start looking at life later on. Because, when you're younger, you still feel like you have endless time, endless time to recover from bad decisions and endless time to keep, um, I guess, starting over, endless time to keep tolerating things that slowly drain you. But later in life, you start paying attention to different things. Your energy, your peace, and your emotional safety. Even simple things feel different now. A quiet morning, no tension in the house, no walking on eggshells, no constant emotional exhaustion, just calm. And people who've never lived through emotional chaos probably hear that and think it sounds boring. But people who have lived through it know exactly what I mean. You know, Peace starts feeling sacred. And honestly, I think that's why a lot of people later in life start changing what they want out of life altogether. Not just relationships, everything. Because after years of surviving, eventually you start asking yourself a different question. Not what do I need to prove anymore, but what actually makes my life feel good now? And I think that's a huge shift because a lot of us spent decades sacrificing ourselves for responsibilities, raising kids, building careers, being husbands, being wives, paying bills, holding families together, trying to survive. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, a lot of people lost themselves without even realizing it. And I guess that's just the natural order of things. But, I know I did. I lost all of that. And when life strips everything away from you, your identity, your health, your stability, and your peace, you start seeing things very differently afterwards. I've talked about pieces of it already on this channel. Well, like living out of my truck for a while, the car accident, breaking my back, my marriage collapsing, narcissistic abuse conversations I've had, and trying to rebuild my life from rock bottom. People hear me talk this way now and think it just came out of nowhere, but it didn't. These realizations came from surviving things that completely changed me as a person. And honestly, I think that's why this channel, or, actually what this channel is starting to shift to. Because I've spent a lot of time talking about the pain and the emotional exhaustion and the betrayal, the loneliness, and even some of the rebuilding process. But I think this next chapter becomes more about what happens after all of that. What happens when you finally stop living in survival mode? What happens when your nervous system finally starts calming down? What happens when you stop searching outside yourself for peace and finally start building it within yourself instead? Because I think people who've never lived through emotional exhaustion struggle to understand this part. After years of anxiety, tension, and trying to keep everybody else happy, you eventually realize peace is not something another person can give you. A relationship can add to your life for sure. And a good person can make it feel better, can make, life itself better. But real peace has to come from within you first. I learned that the hard way because when you lose yourself enough times, you finally understand how dangerous it is to depend on, other people for your happiness, your worth and your emotional stability. People think peace is just silence. I mean, it's not. Peace is being able to sit alone with yourself and actually feel okay. It's waking up without dread. It's finally feeling emotionally safe inside your very own life. And honestly, once you finally experience a taste of peace, you become very protective of it. Not bitter and not closed off, just aware. And, aware of what chaos costs you, aware of how long it takes to rebuild, yourself once you lose who you are. And maybe that's, part of getting older too. But, you stop chasing things just because society says that you're supposed to. You stop forcing relationships that drain you. You stop needing validation from everybody. And you stop living your life based on expectations that don't even make you happy. And instead, you start asking yourself, does this life actually feel peaceful? Does it feel genuine? Does it actually feel like me? And honestly, I think that's where I'm finally arriving at now. I'm no longer trying to escape being alone. Honestly, I'm starting to embrace it. And for the first time in a long time, I'm actually getting back out there and living life again. Because, I think a lot of people our age spent decades sacrificing themselves for their responsibilities. Again, raising kids, being married, living inside careers, constantly taking care of everybody else. And somewhere along the way, a lot of us forgot how to actually live for ourselves too. I think that's a part of what I'm rediscovering now. Not who I needed to be for everybody else, but who I actually am when the noise finally quieted down. And honestly, there's a piece in that I can't fully explain unless, you've lived it long enough to understand it. I'm not bitter. I'm not against love, but I'm also no longer looking for somebody else to complete me emotionally. Because after everything I've lived through, I finally understand that peace and happiness have to come from within first. And now that I'm starting to rebuild that for myself, I intend to protect it. Thank you.